All
Welcome.
right.
Give us just a moment here. We're going to let people come out of the waiting room and join us. We still have several people joining. We'll give it another minute or so before we kick things off. All right. Sarah is joining from Homebase and she's managing the waiting room. So I think we'll continue letting people in. I'm going to go ahead and jump into this in the interest of time. We have an hour together and I want to maximize this. So what I'm going to do is start by sharing my screen. Give me just a moment and let's go. So today we're talking about the student visa interview process, the F1 visa, which is probably what most of you will be seeking before you can come to the United States and start your educational program. Now, I know that this is a process that it instills fear or at the very least confusion and concern. I think very few people really understand how this process works, and even fewer people understand how to prepare for this process. And so, as an introduction, my name is Travis. I used to be a consular officer, which is a fancy word for visa officer. So I worked for our foreign ministry, the US Department of State, and I conducted tens of thousands of visa interviews with applicants from all over the world seeking virtually every kind of visa. Now, in the busy summer months, at least in the Northern Hemisphere summer, many of the applicants I interviewed were seeking F1 visas or sometimes J1 visas to study in the United States. And what I saw far too often were applicants who had come to my interview window and they were just completely unprepared for the interview. They either didn't know what was required or they didn't know how to explain their qualifications. And what you'll see in a moment when I talk about the interview is that the interview was short. I had precious few moments to spend with each applicant. And so if they couldn't explain why they were qualified for a visa, I was often left with no choice but to deny their application. And I will tell you, there is nothing that visa officers hate more than denying applicants. It is not fun, contrary to what you may have heard. It's really hard to deliver bad news. And it's even worse when you're interviewing somebody who may very well qualify for a visa, but they just can't express their qualifications. So now, as an immigration attorney, I have dedicated my practice to helping applicants, like each of you, navigate through this process. So today, I want to talk about the interview process from a high level. I'm going to walk you through what to expect as you go through this journey. Then I'm going to update you on a couple of new requirements, including the now mandatory social media review. I'll explain what's going on there. And then I'll give you a couple of tips on how you should prepare for your interview in the hopes that all of you will be successful. I'm going to leave as much time as I can for questions and answers at the end of my presentation. Sarah is going to moderate the questions that you have. So please feel free to type any questions you have into the chat window, and we'll do our best to get through as many of those as we possibly can. Now, I should mention that although I am a lawyer, the purpose of this presentation is not really for me to provide legal advice. If you have specific legal questions, if you face complications, you have, been denied several times, you have a criminal record, anything that you're concerned about, please don't leave this process to chance. Please reach out to a qualified immigration attorney. I'd be happy if you reach out to me, but honestly, I just want to make sure you get good advice. So reach out to somebody who really knows what they're talking about. With that, let's start with the visa process. So I like to think of the student visa process in five general steps. It really begins after you've been accepted, or at least, a school has offered you a position for you to accept into a program. Once you confirm that you will be attending a specific school, that school will issue you an I-20 form. I think many of you probably have already received an I-20 form from a school you plan to attend. If not, that's probably going to happen very soon. So when you get that I-20 form, take a moment to review it. It's a very simple 1 or 2 page form. Make sure your name is spelled correctly, your date of birth is correct, all the details are accurate. And if everything looks good, now you can start your visa journey. And the first step in that process is to go online and fill out an online application form called the DS-160. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But after you complete that form, after you finalize all of your answers and you submit the form, then you can schedule your visa interview. Now, this is where the first kind of update to the process comes into play. As of September of last year, 2025, you are now limited to schedule your interview in your home country, which means, for all intents and purposes, the country that issued your passport, the country where you are a citizen. However, you might also be able to schedule an interview if you are a permanent resident in a different country, or if you're a long-term resident in a different country. So if you're currently in a foreign country, maybe on a long-term work permit, or you're currently studying abroad, you may be able to schedule an interview in that country, but the safest option is to schedule an interview in your home country. That's the only way you can really guarantee that your interview will be honored. Because I have worked with some students who have scheduled an interview somewhere else, and they don't find out until they get to the interview that now, they're required to go back home. So to be safe and avoid delay, my recommendation would be schedule the interview in your home country. We'll talk about how to prepare for the interview in a moment, but assuming that you are successful, assuming that you can explain your qualifications to your visa officer, the officer will then have to place your application on hold, what's commonly referred to as 221G or administrative processing, while they review your social media. We'll talk about what that review consists of, but assuming that is fine, then your visa will be approved, your passport will be returned to you, and you can travel to the United States. Now, one thing to keep in mind here, on your I-20 form, there is a program start date. You actually have to be physically present in the United States by that program start date. And so your visa officer will be paying special attention to this. At your interview, they want to make sure that you can actually be in the United States by that date. So don't delay. Schedule your interview as early as you can, because if you are subjected to any sort of delay, I would hate for you to get so close to that program start date that your officer ends up denying your application because they're concerned that you can't travel in time. Now, the other limitation here is you can't travel to the United States any earlier than 30 days before that program start date. So think of this as a window of time that you have to travel to the United States before the program start date, and you have to show your officer that this is possible during your interview. So with that in mind, and again, you should start this process as early as you can. The first step in the process is that online application form, the DS-160. So if you go to ceac.state.gov, the website listed here, you will see the first page of that application form. And let me give you a couple of tips here. First of all, I am aware that it is very common in many parts of the world to hire somebody to fill this form out for you, an agent or some sort of, visa expert. Please fill this form out yourself. I'm here to tell you there's nothing in this form that you can't answer. It is only seeking your basic information, your educational history, your work history, your family details. That's it. And only you has all of these details to offer. When you put this in the hands of somebody else, they may make a mistake, and they often do. And because every answer is certified to be true and accurate when it's submitted, even if somebody else submits it on your behalf, if your officer finds anything that doesn't line up, maybe any discrepancy, even if it seems like it might be an error, the best you can probably hope for is a denial. So treat this form seriously because it is serious. It's the first step in a very serious process. Offer as much detail as you can and check your answers before you submit the form. For whatever reason, the form is locked in place once you click the submit button. And so you can't go back and change anything that you answered previously. So double check, triple check, quadruple check your responses before you submit the form. And lastly, I would save screenshots or print out your responses before you submit the form as well. You can't go back and review any of your responses later. And if you're kind of like me and you might wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning one night and say, oh my gosh, did I answer that question correctly? You will have no idea of what you answered if you don't save those responses before you submit the form. So, I want to talk about social media. This is really the beginning of that mandatory social media review that I mentioned, which takes place after the interview. It starts in the DS 160. So, there's a question that you see on the left side of the screen here, which asks for all social media accounts that you have used within the past 5 years. Now, there's a drop down menu, and these are the platforms that the State Department is interested in. I always think it's funny. The question is, have you used MySpace, which I don't think anybody's used in decades, but for some reason they don't ask if you have a TikTok or a WeChat account. So whatever that reasoning is, if you have used any of the accounts, any of the platforms on this list, you must include them in your DS 160 form. Visa officers have been instructed that if they find a platform that you did not list in this form when they do your social media review, that's a good sign. Excuse me. That's a good sign that you're not credible, and that will likely lead to a denial of your application. So, again, to be very clear here, you must list all of your social media accounts. This even includes accounts that are no longer active, and it also includes accounts that you have never really used. So, for example, let's say you have a YouTube account and you've never posted a video. You still have to list that in your DS 160 form because if your officer finds it and then realizes that you didn't mention it, that can lead to a denial. Now, where the form asks, and sorry, I know this is a little bit small, but where the form asks for your social media identifier, I would recommend that you include at least your username, but if you can, I would include the website address, the URL for that account. Doing so can reduce delay and it can help your officer go straight to the account that you have, and hopefully you'll get your visa back sooner. And then finally, set all of your social media accounts to public. And if you want to set them back to private, you can do so after you get your visa and your passport back. So, with that understood, I'm sure you're all wondering, what does the visa officer look for? What is this social media review? Well, they're looking for several things. First, they're looking for kind of more scary or serious issues. Things like evidence that you may be supporting a terrorist organization, maybe evidence that you're doing something illegal. That could be you consuming controlled substances or something, which hopefully none of you have posted online. But it could also be maybe overly political posts, which show that you may harbor a hostile attitude towards the United States government, or hate speech, like anti Semitic speech. So, first of all, visa officers are looking for this type of content. But even beyond that, they're also looking for maybe evidence that you might have violated a previous visa. And I've seen this come up in situations where, maybe an applicant was previously in the United States on another student visa. and they've got a picture of themselves that looks like they're working at a restaurant. Well, while you're in the United States on a student visa, there are very stringent restrictions on the type of work that you can engage in. And so that alone could raise concerns that maybe you violated the terms of a previous visa. And then, as I mentioned, every answer that you provide in your DS 160 and also during your interview, you are basically certifying to be true and honest and accurate. And so, if the officer finds any discrepancies when they're looking at your social media that doesn't completely line up to maybe what you've answered in your DS 160 or what you've explained during your interview, that can lead to major concerns. So, here's my recommendation as you're preparing for the interview. First of all, it is a good idea to look through all of your social media accounts. I do not recommend that you delete anything because I am aware that the State Department can likely see deleted posts, and that can raise other concerns. So instead of deleting anything, I would look and be aware of what's out there. And if you think there's anything that may lead to concerns, that fit in one of these categories or maybe one of these categories, you should be prepared to explain that during your interview. Now, hopefully, none of you will find any difficulties through this process. It can take as little as a few hours or maybe a day, but it can take a couple of weeks. And so, again, I recommend that you start your process as early as possible. Don't delay, because if you are subjected to a delay, you don't want that to essentially disqualify you from obtaining your visa. Okay, so let's talk about the interview itself. This is the most critical stage of the process. And so, for those of you who have not applied for a visa of any kind for the United States before, let me tell you how the process looks. First of all, US visa officers are not law enforcement personnel. They don't wear uniforms, they don't carry guns, they don't wear bulletproof vests. They look like me. They look like Sarah. They look like regular people, like this guy you see in the picture. This is a real visa officer. So it's not a super intense conversation that you might be expecting, but it is incredibly quick. When I was a visa officer, I would routinely interview well over 120 applicants every single day. And so, as I was mentioning earlier, I had very little time to spend with each individual applicant at each interview. I had maybe a minute, sometimes 2 minutes, maybe as many as 3 minutes, but that was it. And when an applicant would approach my window, I was responsible for looking through a lot of information. So my face was generally buried in a computer monitor to the side of the window where I was looking at things like DS 160 responses. And I would often ask the first question while I was still looking at my computer screen to save time. So don't be alarmed if the officer doesn't really look you in the eye, make direct eye contact. That's just kind of how the process works. And then I do want you to plan to speak English. Officers are not evaluating if your English is perfect. They don't expect you to speak with really complex sentence structures or, complex vocabulary, but they do want to ensure that you have at least a basic fundamental understanding of the language. And that's because classes in the United States are predominantly taught in English. So the officer wants to make sure, first and foremost, that you can understand what is being taught in the US classroom so that you can actually pass your classes and graduate. And then finally, don't rely on documents. This is something that applicants used to do all the time when I was an officer. I would ask a question and they would just try to shove a bunch of pieces of paper at me as a response. Officers are trained not to look at documents because, if nothing else, it can be confusing and it can be a waste of time. But documents can also be fake. And so instead of that, focus on verbalizing your responses. Documents can be useful as backup if the officer asks to see something, like maybe a bank statement or a loan agreement. But otherwise, I want you to focus on explaining your qualifications verbally. And so that takes me to the considerations that your officer is going to be thinking about at the interview. This may be the most important slide that I share during this whole presentation because this is what I want you to keep in mind as you prepare for your interview. So during your interview, your officer is first trying to evaluate if you're actually planning to be a student. So if they approve this F1 visa, are you going to use that to enter the United States, enroll in a full course load, attend class, and eventually graduate? And of course, that's where they evaluate if you understand English. But also, they're looking for evidence that maybe you have a different plan. Are you, instead of planning to actually be a student, are you instead planning to maybe move in with a family member or find a job so you can send money back home? So that's the first question that they're exploring. The second consideration is, have you made enough financial arrangements such that you can pay for your tuition and your living expenses? And then third, do you at least presently, right now, intend to leave the United States after you graduate? And this is what we commonly refer to as having ties to home. Do you have a plan in place that will take you out of the United States, or are you going to stay in the United States permanently? Now, remember, the F1 visa is what's called a non immigrant visa. That means that while it does grant you access to the country, it doesn't allow you to stay permanently. You're only actually allowed to stay while you are an active student. And so you do have to establish for your officer that you have a pretty good likelihood that you're going to leave the country when your studies come to an end. Now, this is something that I think very few people understand, but the way the law is written, the default assumption that a visa officer is required to make is denial, unless you, the applicant, demonstrate why you are qualified. And so think about the interview as your opportunity, really your responsibility to tell the officer why you deserve the visa. And when you do so, I want you to remember to be proactive. Short responses, one word responses, vague responses do nothing to help you establish that you are planning to be a student, you can afford the expense, and you have ties to home. So as you prepare for your interview, I want you to think about prioritizing some key details. And remember, it's your responsibility to verbally explain these details during the interview when you're standing in front of your officer. So you should be prepared to explain, of course, what school you will be attending, what you will be studying, and maybe what degree you're pursuing. And then I want you to explain why you have made this decision. Why did you choose this school? Why did you choose this major or degree program? Why did you decide to study in the United States in general? That's a great way of kind of establishing that you're really planning to be a student as opposed to just making up a story to achieve a different goal. Then you should be prepared to explain your financial arrangements. And finally, your specific plans after you graduate, because that's how you establish that you have those ties to home. So I know that this is a lot. One thing that I would recommend is you should all have access to the Homebase platform. That's how you've heard about this webinar. After this session, you will receive an email with a link to access the Homebase community. It's a super powerful community where you can get access to lots of insights and connect with other international students and schools. So I do recommend that you access the community. And when you do, you will see some lessons that we've prepared together with Homebase. We have a lesson that walks you through kind of an introduction to the DS 160. We have a lesson that explains the general 5-step process that I talked about to apply for a visa. And we also have a lesson that covers the 3 considerations your officer is thinking about as they reach their decision. Now, in those lessons, if you are interested in more guidance, more help, We have links that will take you to online video-based courses that we've developed. So we have an in-depth, end-to-end guide that covers the DS-160, where we go through every single question in the form, and we give you advice about how to complete the form yourself and how to avoid complications in the process. We then have a course that focuses on the interview itself. We go through a proven formula for you to prioritize your key details and for you to explain those details in a way that will resonate with your visa officer. Then we have a complete end-to-end guide. It starts when you receive the I-20 form. It covers the DS-160, how to prepare for the interview. We talk about how to handle questions about previous refusals, what to do if you may have family members who will come and join you, what to do if you're thinking about OPT after you graduate. And that complete guide includes access to a bi-weekly question and answer session with either myself or my partner. Both of us are former visa officers and immigration attorneys. So log into Homebase when you get the link, take a look at our guidance. And if you do need additional help, please don't leave this to chance. And then finally, I mentioned when I began, if you have specific questions, if you have maybe a complicated situation, maybe you have a criminal record, you've been refused before, maybe you've already had your interview and you're stuck in an administrative processing delay, or maybe you just want to practice a mock interview with a former visa officer, send us an email to info@zfvisa.com and we'll let you know how we can help. Again, please don't leave this process to chance. It is difficult, but with the right preparation and the right strategy, I'm hopeful that you will succeed. So with that, I think we're right on time. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And Sarah, if we want to start taking questions, I'll get through as many as I can. It looks like there's a lot of questions here.
Yes, we do have a lot of questions. I took some notes throughout, and I think some of them can definitely be summarized and answered in a group. First one, let's start with social media accounts. You mentioned the obvious stuff. What about if the social media account is not used anymore, or it was recently banned, or recently disabled? What should they do?
This gets really difficult. So, as a general rule, the State Department, your visa officer, will expect that you list everything, even if it has been deactivated or deleted or disabled or banned. You really do need to list it. Because, again, if the officer finds that account and then they find that you didn't mention it in your application form, that will often lead to a denial or some other serious complication. Now, I am aware that in some situations, you may not know your previous username. You may not be able to access the account, or maybe you can't change it to public if it no longer exists, right? If that is the situation, you might think about volunteering that during your interview. Just so you're aware, this is what's going on with that Facebook account, for example. But I think what you should think of as your goal is to be as transparent as possible and just provide as much detail as you can.
So there's no such thing as oversharing on social media accounts.
No, I would say
All right.
absolutely not.
What if they've already filled out their DS-160 and they wake up at 3 a.m. They're like, there's one more account if I got to share. What should they do?
This is a good question. So, as I mentioned earlier, when you submit the DS-160 form, it's locked in place. You can't go back and edit anything. This is a really unfortunate situation. So, in that situation, the only option you have is to submit an entirely new DS-160 form. I know that's not the answer you wanted because I know this is time consuming and the opposite of enjoyable, but you should submit an entirely new form. Again, double check that everything is correct before you submit it. Then you will need to reach out to the embassy or consulate where you scheduled your interview and let them know, hey, I found a mistake in my previous form. I submitted a new form, and let them know what the new application ID number is from that new form. I would recommend that you do this through the website where you scheduled your interview. they should update your interview profile with that new application ID number up to one time, sometimes maybe twice, but there's no guarantee. So if you can't get a response, if they're not willing to update the form, that's where you may want to reach out to an immigration lawyer. Because what I would probably look at is how serious was the error, and we could walk through, some considerations for that situation.
All right. Let's see. I'm gonna go into another area, funding. How important is it to explain the funding on the I-20, especially if the funding comes from the school itself? They have a scholarship, stipend, stuff like that. How do they best explain that, prepare for it, and is it going to hurt them in their visa interview process?
So funding is a key consideration. The officer is required by the regulations to confirm that you have enough money to pay for the program and your living expenses. Now, the I-20 is not it's not like a clearly defined document. And what I mean by that is there's no kind of magic phrasing or magic language on that form that the officer needs to see. Instead, the officer is going to look at your I-20 form to see, first of all, what is the estimated cost for the first year or the first couple of semesters of your program? And then, second, what have you demonstrated to your school that you have already kind of set aside or earmarked for this program? Because every school has a unique review process where they look at bank statements and other things before they issue the I-20 form. So what the officer expects you to do is A, explain with context where your money comes from. If the I-20 says that the first year is estimated to cost, let's say, 100,000 US dollars, well, how is it possible that you have $100,000 ready to be put towards this program? But then also, they also need to know that you have the rest of the money either already set aside for the rest of the program, or that there is some sort of ability for you to pay that remaining expense. Now, remember, when you are in the United States on an F1 visa, your ability to work is heavily restricted. So it's generally not acceptable for you to say, well, I'm going to pay the rest of my tuition from, a job that I'm going to have in the United States. It's pretty well expected that you've already made arrangements to pay for the entire program without having to resort to work in the US. Now, there are exceptions to that. For example, if you're planning to go for a PhD program and you will have some sort of assistantship, that's, maybe an exception, and we could talk about that offline. But generally speaking, you need to show that you've already made arrangements to cover the entire cost, and you need to explain that with context to really demonstrate that this money exists or will exist.
So, what about a few students that have already received their I-20, they made their visa appointment, and now they realize, I'm like, I want to update my funding. I have additional family members contributing, or I'm just shifting things around. Should they update that before the visa interview? After? What else is important to consider?
Well, the first thing I would do is I would reach out to your school. Your school is the one who issues the I-20 form. So talk to them about kind of the change in circumstances. You may not need a new I-20 form in certain situations, but talk to the school first and make sure that the form at least generally references the preparations that you've made. And then it's more important during your interview that you explain your plans. The I-20 form is really kind of more of a general guide, a general overview of what you're doing. The interview is your opportunity to be specific. And so yeah, I would start with your school. And yeah, if you do need to have an update to the I-20, that would ideally happen before you go to the interview. So you're presenting the most up-to-date form that you can.
For financial documents to bring to the actual interview, should those be the exact same documents they submit to the school for the I-20? Should it be originals? Can it be copies?
This
Does
very
it
much
matter?
depends because every school has kind of a different set of requirements. And this is actually something that we go through in depth in the online courses that I mentioned. So it probably is a good idea to take a look at that. I think as a general rule, I want 99% of your focus to be on verbally explaining your financial arrangements. It is a good idea to bring proof of those arrangements in whatever format you have. That could be a bank statement, it could be a loan document, it could be a letter from the school talking about a scholarship. But I wouldn't even expect that the officer will see that. They really want to hear from you, from your mouth, what your arrangements are. And then you should just plan to have something to confirm that if they ask to see it.
All right. All right. Gonna sh shift away from funding towards ties to the home country and complicating things by they have family in the US. How do they best address that situation?
This can be complicated. It's not something that will automatically disqualify you, first of all. So hopefully that's good news. But I think, the first thing I would say here is honesty is crucial throughout this process. Everybody has some situation that they may be a little bit concerned about, for the visa interview. It is far more important that you answer every question in that DS 160 and during the interview honestly, even if you think it might hurt your chance of success. Assume that your visa officer knows everything about you. I mean, of course they don't, but they probably know if you have family in the US or if you've been denied before or, all these things that people are concerned about. So step one is just being honest and answering that question honestly if it comes up. Now, why is family in the United States a potential concern? Well, it tends to erode that conclusion that you have ties to home, that you have at least, some compelling reason to leave the United States after you graduate. And that's because if you have family in the country, it may be that you're planning to move in with them. They might even help you find a job and, they're your support network. I'm not saying that's fair, but that's kind of how a visa officer will think. So this is something that we go through in detail in our online courses as well. It's really how well you articulate and how clearly you articulate your plans after you graduate. It's never going to be sufficient to just say, after I graduate, I'm going home and I'm going to find a job. Anybody could say that, right? And that's probably what I would say if I was trying to hide the fact that I was planning to stay in the United States too. So I want you to challenge yourself to think about exactly what you're planning to do. And that's what you need to explain during the interview.
All right. Let's see. Similar topic. So you had mentioned the visa officer will most likely know if you've previously been refused a visa. What if you previously withdrew an application for a visa? Do they know that too? And then should that be addressed?
This depends. This is where you probably want to reach out to an immigration attorney to get a specific answer. In many cases, assuming that a previous application was for a non-immigrant visa, maybe you scheduled an interview for a student visa last year and you canceled it or you just didn't show up. Chances are good that the officer won't even know about that, and it shouldn't show up as a refusal or a denial, because really you need to present your qualifications to a visa officer before you can be approved or denied. But to be sure, I would reach out to an immigration lawyer and go through your specific situation because there are exceptions to that rule, including with immigrant visas or sometimes what are called petition-based work visas. And so there may be a situation where you should disclose that, and failing to do so could lead to complications.
That makes sense. All right, I'm gonna shift it back to social media because there's two interesting questions here. How what type of access to visa officers have when it comes to social media? Is it the same information that we publicly have answers to? Like how do they find the social media profiles? I'm assuming it's more than just a Google search.
First of all, I do not know for sure. This is a classified, confidential policy that they have. I'm friends with many current visa officers. We still stay in touch. I do not ask them those questions because I don't think it would be ethical. I don't think it would be proper. What I tell my clients is they do have the ability to look at your profiles. They have the ability to see your posts, including deleted posts. And so just assume that whatever you have in a social media account or elsewhere on the internet is going to be reviewed. And I think that's kind of the way you have to proceed.
Basically, whatever's on the internet will stay there for forever, even if you delete it, remove it, try to hide it. All right. Um, let's see. What if we have an individual that doesn't have any social media accounts?
That's a great question. And people come to me all the time saying, "Should I create a social media account just for my interview?" No, please don't. I want you to be yourself. And this applies to the entire process. Be yourself. The more authentic, the more real and honest you can be, the better your chance of success, just generally speaking, will be. If you don't have any social media accounts, and I'm only on LinkedIn. I'm not really on social media, generally speaking. Uh, your visa officer may ask you, is it you really don't have any social media? That's where I want you to be honest. No, I don't. Maybe explain why, because that applies to some people. So again, don't create and don't delete anything for the interview. Just be prepared to be yourself.
All right. Going off of that again, you showed us a drop-down list of all the social media platforms. Now, there's gonna be some that aren't listed there. Should they still share that, provide any sort of link, screenshot, user handle to show them like, hey, this is something else I use?
That's another good question. Let me share my screen for a moment. I want to go back to that screenshot and I will answer you.
And then
Okay.
while you're going to that, I'm going to add on one more question, kind of similar.
Mhm.
What are some social media accounts that students often forget about? Like I'm thinking like LinkedIn. I don't think of LinkedIn as a social media,
Hmm.
but it actually is. Or just your YouTube account for watching videos. So those are two things. What are some other common ones that you're aware of that people often
Yeah.
forget?
So to answer the first question, what if I have other accounts, like maybe a TikTok account, maybe I have a website, anything like that? You can see at the bottom of the left side here, it says, "Do you wish to provide information about your presence on any other websites or applications you have used within the last 5 years?" You could say yes there and then list them there. And I often do advise students to do that. Some students and other applicants as well, they may have a personal website where they, post a portfolio of artwork. They may have a blog somewhere online. They may have, lots of information on GitHub, for example. I see no reason not to list all of that there. If you think that this is something your visa officer may encounter when they look through your kind of general online presence, you might as well show it. And then you're showing that you are being completely, transparent and forthcoming, which is a good thing. Now, the second question, what do people often forget about? So first of all, yes, LinkedIn is, I guess, technically considered to be a social media platform. So I think the first step here is look through the drop-down menu, which I'm showing on the screen here. If you have used any of these platforms within the past 5 years, go ahead and list them. Reddit, that's not really something I would consider to be social media, but if you've got a Reddit account, you should list it. The place that I think most students are uh, kind of making a mistake here is if they have an account that they really have never actively used. And YouTube is a common example of this. So I think in many instances, if you have a Gmail account for email, you automatically have a YouTube account. Or if you have any sort of Google account, often your YouTube account is basically automatically set up. And so if you have a YouTube account, even if you've never posted a video, go ahead and list it. Because that's where a visa officer may say, well, wait a minute, Sarah's got this YouTube account and she didn't list it in her DS 160. What else is she trying to hide? So again, I think the first step is look through this list and make sure you list everything that appears on this list.
So gonna go off of this. When they're working through the DS-160, can they pause or save their progress, do their research, find all the handles, go back to the form, or does it have to be completed in one setting?
Yes. So with all the weird faults of the DS-160 process, the one good feature is that you can save your process and come back later. So when
So
you
there's
start the form, you actually have to answer a security question. So make sure you save that answer, or at least remember the answer you provided, and also save the application ID number that the form generates. That's basically the unique identifier that will lead you back to that form. Then you can save your progress and log back in at any time, but there are a couple of limitations. You have to submit the form within 60 days after you start it, and you have to log into the form at least once every 30 days, or it will be considered inactive and it will be deleted from the system. So I think the best rule would be, give yourself a couple of weeks, but aim to finish it within a couple of weeks, and then you shouldn't have any complications.
right. You perfectly set up my next question, which is when is the best time to submit the DS-160? Should they do it as soon as they have their I-20, they start working on it, they submit it, even if their visa interview's 2, 3 months out? Or is it do it, I don't know, 2 weeks before your interview,
No,
if
do
you
it right
can?
now. You get your I-20, you're going to that school, start your DS-160 and submit it as soon as you can. And that's important for a couple of reasons. First, it's no longer possible to schedule an interview before you submit your DS-160. Now, it may be technically possible. I know that you can pay a fee and schedule an interview, and there's not like an automated check that you've already submitted your form. But a growing number of embassies and consulates are doing that check in the background. And there are applicants who are starting to face interview cancellations and interview delays if the State Department determines that they scheduled the interview before they submitted the DS-160. So, really, kind of order of magnitude is finalize that DS-160, submit it, then schedule the earliest interview you can.
Great. That's good to know. All right. Let's see. Looking through the chat right here. Um, okay. This might be very unique, and you might sound like they should contact you or another immigration attorney. But what if they had a previous study in the US? They want to get a new visa for a new program of study. Their family lives in the US and the family is the sponsor. Very unique situation where they should contact an
Yeah,
immigration attorney.
so I'm gonna talk about this a little bit generally. Yes, definitely you need to contact an immigration attorney. There's 100 more questions I would need to ask before I could give you any semblance of an answer here. But this kind of goes to a more general question of should I travel or not? This is a really common question that students ask me if they're already in the United States. Is it safe to travel? And I want to address that quickly here because my answer is almost always it depends. I'm a big proponent of maintaining your ties to your home. You should feel comfortable returning home and reconnecting with your family and your friends. I think that's really important. I would personally not want to go to a foreign country and feel trapped there. I think that'd be very stressful. But there are often risks associated with international travel. So the one thing that I want to say here, and then definitely talk to a lawyer and evaluate those risks. But the one thing I want you to do, so when your visa is approved, it will have an expiration date on it. Now, this is confusing because that is not the deadline that you have to leave the United States, although it may seem like it is. That is just the expiration date of your ticket that gets you into the country. Think of your visa like a ticket into the United States. Once you enter the United States as a student, you can actually remain in the country as long as you are maintaining your status. So essentially, that generally means, going to class, generally progressing towards graduation. It could include approved work experiences like OPT. So the expiration date of your visa is completely irrelevant for how long you can stay in the country. However, if you are traveling internationally, even if you're going somewhere just across the border in Mexico or Canada, if your visa is expired, you cannot re enter the United States until you renew that visa. And so I would say track that expiration date, set a calendar reminder, think about it mentally, and plan ahead. Because the last thing I would want to see is you're studying, you're doing everything right, and maybe there's an emergency back at home. Maybe a parent is ill or somebody dies, and so you have to travel internationally. If your visa is already expired and you haven't made, prior preparations, you may find that you're stuck out of the country for a long time while you wait for an interview or experience other delays. So track that expiration date and plan ahead.
All right. Looking through more questions. I'm listening to you and I forget to look for questions while you're answering the question. I'm like, I don't know those answers too. All right. Let's see. Um, okay, ties to the home country. What if they attended a visa interview? It got denied due to a lack of ties to the home country. However, they weren't asked any questions.
Hmm.
How would determinations like that have been made without having said anything?
Yeah, so people often reach out to me and say, well, the visa officer didn't ask. And my response to that is remember, it's your responsibility during the interview to volunteer those key details. A visa officer may not ask specific questions, and if you don't volunteer specific details, they may not know. And a really good example of this would be if you have a scholarship. There's no requirement that you have a scholarship to qualify for a student visa, just to be clear. But if you have been awarded a scholarship by your university or, some organization, that's a really positive detail to share because that tends to show that somebody has, done some further evaluation about your student intent, your student qualifications. And of course, it can also tend to prove that you can pay for the program. So, details like that, details about your plans after you graduate, your situation at home, all of these can really help improve your chance of success. But if you don't volunteer them, even if you're not asked a specific question, if you don't volunteer those details, your officer simply won't know that detail and they may deny you when otherwise they would have approved you. And that's something that we cover in detail in these online courses. It's really an art, not a science. It's an art of prioritizing the most important positive details about your situation, your plans, your motivations, and then articulating those details in a way that is going to resonate with your officer. So I really do recommend that you review this guidance because it can help you kind of get your head in the right direction for hopefully a successful outcome.
Like, come up with a 30-second elevator pitch, knowing the most important things about yourself that might be asked of you. Practice that saying it out loud in English so that you're comfortable doing so and you're not going to be caught off guard.
Yes, and by the way, Sarah, that's a good point. I do recommend practice. I think practice and even mental preparation is important here, with one caveat. Don't practice an elevator pitch so many times that it becomes memorized. Because what happens is you'll appear in front of a visa officer and then you sound like a robot. You're just reciting something. And the first thing your officer is likely to conclude is somebody else told you what to say to be approved. And now they're going to question whether any of this is even credible in the first place. So when you do practice, I want you to be natural, be authentic, be yourself. Change the way you introduce yourself every time you practice so it doesn't just turn into a memorized speech.
Got it. All right. All right. Shifting to something different. The I-20 lists a zip code. Now, what if that zip code is very different from the actual program of study or what's it on the admission letter? And even if you as a student, you know how to explain why you chose the school and what you want to study, what if it seems like a huge discrepancy with what's on the I-20? What do visa officers know and understand about it?
So first of all, I'll answer that second question first. The I-20 is generally understood to be more general, more generic. And a good example of that is, the I-20 might say Master of Science in Engineering, when in reality, you're studying, a data analytics, computer science degree with a focus on finance or something. It's not engineering at all. That really is up to kind of how your school categorizes your particular degree program. Visa officers understand that. So your I-20 may say one thing. I want you to be as specific as possible during the interview to explain what you're truly going to be doing. And if it is a situation where your real major or degree plan is, it sounds different than what appears on the I-20, describe how it is related. You may say something like, I'm going to pursue a master's degree in data analytics. Technically, it's part of the engineering program at my school, and that's why my I-20 says this. Of course, I'm making this up, but that would be an example. Now, the other question is actually very complicated. I think this is somebody who's probably going to what we call a day one CPT program. There are schools that authorize work experiences starting on the first day classes begin. Some of these schools may be located far away from where you're planning to live. That can raise serious concerns. It's not an automatic disqualification, but you do need to be prepared to explain that. So I would say definitely reach out to an immigration lawyer, reach out to us if you want to, and we can help you prepare.
Great. All right. We have a question about bringing an F2. How does that impact your visa interview, your ties to home, and any advice on like how to make that interview successful?
Yeah, so the F2 interview is kind of similar to the F1 interview, but the officer is considering a couple of different factors. First, they want to make sure that your family members are actually related to you. So, they may ask to see a marriage certificate or a birth certificate just kind of at the outset. They may even ask your spouse, how you two met each other. When did you get married? Again, just to verify that this is a real relationship. And then of course, they're looking at your family members' ties to home. Are you all planning to leave the United States when you should, or is this just an excuse to get your whole family to the country and stay permanently, which you're not allowed to do? And then third, they will be more interested in the financial arrangements here. And that's because F2 visa holders cannot work while they're in the United States. And this is weird, but they cannot even work remotely. So it's a pretty firm, strict requirement that enough money has already been arranged now, not only to cover you and your expenses, but also the expenses of your family members. So that's where I would spend some effort to make sure you can articulate the arrangements that you've made so that your officer isn't worried that somebody may be working without authorization.
Right. I'm gonna piggyback off of that. So if typically schools on for the dependents have a certain fee that gets added to the I-20, what about, so since there's additional funding needed, should they be prepared to show proof way beyond what's on the I-20 and what's required from the school?
They should. I mean, I think as a general rule, you need to establish that you already have money set aside, basically cash ready to pay for the first year of your program, whatever is listed on the I-20 form. And then the regulations say you have to be able to articulate how you're going to pay for the rest of the program as well. But I think it's generally understood, especially if you're embarking on a multi-year program. I don't think anybody expects that you have hundreds of thousands of US dollars just sitting around. I mean, that doesn't make any sense. So it's generally understood that you could talk about how that money will be available in the future. This is another thing that we talk about in our online courses because it can get a little nuanced. But I think as a general rule, I want you to be prepared to just honestly explain the arrangements that you've made.
All
Sarah,
right.
I do apologize. I probably have to
Yes.
jump in a minute or two. Maybe we could take one more question
Great.
here.
I'm gonna make it a tough one. What about visa interviews from travel banned countries?
That is a tough one. So, all right,
Sorry.
very quickly, travel. No, I'm glad you asked that. The immigration kind of restrictions are changing rapidly. So, first of all, I'm going to put a link into the chat window that I want all of you to bookmark. Give me just a second. This is probably the best place. It's at least the best place I know of to try to stay up to date with bans, pauses, restrictions, all the other stuff going on. If you find that you are from a country that will not qualify for a student visa or generally a non immigrant visa, and that's a distinction, by the way. Immigrant visas are visas that you would apply for if you're moving to the country permanently. So there are many countries that are, subject to an immigrant visa pause. That doesn't concern you. If you find that you're from a country that cannot qualify for an F1 or generally a non-immigrant visa, then your options are unfortunately limited. In many instances, you can still schedule an interview. Submit your I-20 DS-160 form, schedule an interview. You should even be able to appear for your interview, but you will either be denied or your application will be put on hold under what's called administrative processing until this policy changes. Now, I wish I could tell you when these pauses and suspensions will be lifted, but unfortunately, I don't know. Like all of you, I'm monitoring the news as it comes. I actually have an Excel spreadsheet that I use to track the countries subject to these restrictions. It is super complicated. So I think my best advice, unfortunately, is try to monitor the news as it develops. When you see a change, move forward as quickly as you can. And I am very hopeful that we see some of these, restrictions being lifted soon.
Great. All right. Thank you so much, Travis, for your time, your expertise. Everybody will get a recording of this meeting. You will get all the relevant links and information about CF visa guides, Homebase. You will have additional resources that, or we'll have additional resources we'll share with you. Um, Again, thank you, Travis. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for everybody, or thank you to everybody for joining. I put my email address in the chat window if you have more questions. I know we didn't get to anywhere near all of your questions. But also, as I mentioned earlier, you will receive an email from Homebase, which has a link to access their community. I would recommend that you walk through our free lessons that we've put up there. I think that's a great place to
Definitely.
start your journey. And if you need more help, go into one of our courses. Access one of our courses through those links. Any other questions, reach out to us. I wish you all the
Yes.
best. I really hope you're all successful in the process.
Great. Thank you. And then we have a few more of these coming up. So feel free to sign up for any other webinars that we have. And like Travis said, we'll we'll see you or you will see us in your inbox. Thank you.
Definitely. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.